Kieran, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on today. And to give everyone a bit of context, Kieran and I have been close friends for a very, very long time. And I've actually been partly in witness to quite a lot of your journey that we're going to speak about today. But I really, really appreciate your time. And I suppose my first question is the big one, which is, what is a hybrid athlete? What is it? What does a hybrid athlete do?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Certainly been a long time, hasn't it? So jumping straight into it then, so many different ways you can define it, particularly with how the industry has taken that term and kind of run with it. The original definition and credit goes to Alex Viada here, who has very much been under the radar, I guess, with this sort of new explosion of how it's seen. And the whole idea is not necessarily combining running and bodybuilding or running and strength. It doesn't have to be any two particular components. The only prerequisite for something to be hybrid, quote unquote, as per the definition, is that it's two or more elements of fitness that don't directly complement each other in terms of, if you get better in one sport, it's not going to directly contribute to you getting better in the other. And you're just trying to drive performance in both of those at any one time. So the classic example, for example, is that rugby has, as a sport, many disparate components, but they all go together at making you better at rugby. So if your only sport is rugby, quote unquote, you're only training for one sport, therefore not hybrid. If, for example, you were trying to push running and strength as two separate components and you wanted to do well in them, that, as per the definition, is what people call hybrid. And ultimately, I think the semantics don't matter quite as much as some people would have you believe. But I think it's important just to give a bit of credit to Alex there for essentially the advent of all of this. But for me and my own personal views, I just like the idea of combining two things that don't support each other, or two or more, and take it from there, basically.
I'm really, really glad you actually went back to the root definition there, because I think that it seems to have exploded on social media, the whole hybrid. And what's funny is, coming from a military perspective like you have, military fitness has always been functional and hybrid by definition, because it's just about capability and role performance, as opposed to any kind of definitional label. But I think in layman's terms, it's you can run fast, lift heavy, have a good 5K time, but also be jacked.
Yeah, ultimately, what more do people care about for what people actually want to train for? We can dress it up on social media as much as we want, but essentially that's what 90% of people want. And run fast, lift heavy, as you well know, is obviously the tagline of one of my most popular programs from my previous business. So yeah, run fast, lift heavy always has a special place in my heart. It's how I particularly like to define hybrid, but these days there's a much more cycling element in there for me. So there's not a nice tagline for that. It doesn't sound quite as good. Cycle fast, lift heavy.
Yeah, just spin and lift for life or something. Yeah, it doesn't quite work as well, does it?
Not the same, is it?
But that actually led me on to kind of, from my perspective, literally the entire time that I've known you, well over 8 years now, you have always been operating at bare minimum within the top 5%, if not the top 1% of athletic endeavors. And, those who listen to the podcast will know, like, that's my definition of high performance. Where are you setting your sights? Is it, is when you enter something, are you aiming for the top 95 percentile or the 98th, 99th? And I'd love to understand the journey you've gone through in terms of your physical capability, even stripping it right back to when you first got into the gym. I think I remember it was like around, 15, 16, something like that.
Yeah.
I'd love if you just gave us a run through of like that journey, because it's been really quite varied.
It certainly has. And it's quite interesting for me because I've got a bit more sort of talent and background in the things that I never ended up pursuing. I essentially made my life harder than it had to be, in that when I first got into fitness, it was because I did really well in your sort of year 7, year 8. The first time you start doing like hard PE sessions, all of a sudden, your first sort of hard cross country run, for example, you're like, oh, I've actually done pretty well here. I'd never formally trained, just had an active childhood, healthy body weight, and therefore, could run okay for a what are you in year 7, like 12, 13? So, could run reasonably well for a 13-year-old, nothing groundbreaking whatsoever. And just did a few little high school meets. Obviously, here in the UK, that doesn't mean anywhere near as much as it does mean in other places. Like, don't, if you're listening to this, think I was any kind of high school athlete, because I absolutely wasn't. Nothing really kicked off until I had some recruiters from a place called Welbeck, which is obviously where me and Jake met, come to my school and talk about how great this college was. It was a feeder school or a college for people joining the armed forces in technical roles as an officer, and it was supposed to develop your leadership. You do your A levels there, a lot of fitness training, that kind of thing, and it sounded fantastic. So I saw that as an opportunity. I started really pushing my running, and for about a year, from age about 15 was when I applied. You go to college at 16. I was really pushing my running hard. The thing for me was that I was very, very skinny from pushing all the running hard. You probably didn't see me in first year of college before all of this really came to a head, but I was really, really quite skinny, even so for my age. And it was wanting to change that where I really sort of fell in love with the gym. And I was quite lucky that in my high school, my PE teachers co-owned a CrossFit gym. So rather than the sort of just curling and chest days and nothing else, we were encouraged from a very, very young age. I think I was 15 when I hit my first 100-kilo squat, because our PE teachers just pushed us. They said, like, if you want to be well-rounded, if you want to do well in these kind of things, then you need to be training full body. You need to not be neglecting the lower body, for example. And there's so much value in that. And I'm forever grateful to that, because it really, really set the foundations for pushing strength training hard, and not just bodybuilding or, wanting to do curls and abs for days. So when we then got to college, fell really hard into powerlifting. Took it too far, as you well know and will remember. Chunky Kieran was pretty big. I got up to I got up to nearly 100 kilos body weight from really, really pushing powerlifting. For context, I weighed less than 80 when I went to uni, and in 2 years I went from 77 to 97 kilograms. And I wasn't, obviously I was pretty fluffy, but a lot of that was good mass. I really, really put on a lot of weight from just training with a team. And I think that's where so much of what I've achieved has come from, where I've always had a team around me. And at Welbeck, obviously, we used to run together. We've pushed each other hard on the endurance sessions. Then in uni, I had the powerlifting team, and they were all so much better than me. And a story I always remember is that when I first joined that powerlifting team, I put nearly 20 kilograms on my bench in probably six months or so, just from training with people that much stronger than me. And they helped me with every element of execution. And before you know it, from training in that environment, you are unrecognizable. That first 6 months with the powerlifting team, it blew my mind of what was possible. I started to realize, oh, you know what? I can actually go somewhere with this. Long story short, I did not go somewhere with that, because I did not enjoy being fat. Made me pretty slow. I didn't like seeing people who I knew I was previously fitter than beat me on fitness tests and things like that when we were at uni. And it was getting a bit close to Sandhurst. And that was where I did a complete 180. I dropped 10 kilos in 6 months, cut down for a boxing fight, went all in on running and strength. And that's where the hybrid side really came to sort of a head for me, really, really pushing strength and fitness. And by the time I went to Sandhurst, I was in a place where I felt my running and strength numbers concurrently were really quite rare. And then I've kind of maintained that throughout my whole career. My first unit was an airborne unit, and I was very, very lucky to have that influence, and meant I got to go train for the airborne selection course, P company. And it meant I had a group of absolute savages around me who could just run me into the ground. And I've never been somewhere with such competitive PT. And again, just coming back to that team element, having those people to push me is essentially the only reason my running reached the level it did. So now in a position where I've pulled off a few of these challenges that I know for a fact I wouldn't have done had I not been surrounded by people pushing my running. So I guess, long story short, I've always been in some kind of team environment, whether that was, the pseudo CrossFit gym at my high school, whether that was then us training together at Welbeck, then the powerlifting team at uni, and then obviously my first units and beyond then as my military career progressed, I've always had that team aspect around, and it, I think, explains a huge amount of why I've been able to do what I've been able to do.
100%. And by the way, I just appreciate you laying that out so clearly. And there was things in there that I'd forgotten about, like the boxing. But
Yeah.
the undercurrent of this is it's all been about the people you surround yourself with are the ones that you compare yourself to, and that's, that classic saying of you're the product of the 5 people closest to you, but realistically, it's the 5 people you compare yourself to, and that actually, when you lay it out longitudinally like that, makes complete sense as to why you ended up where you ended up. Joining Omnia, because for me, as a throw the old quotations in there, but as a hybrid athlete, or at least a refurbished one, Omnia has always been the gold standard for athletic coaching. And what's interesting is you guys won't know this at home, but Kieran was actually my very first coach. I'd never had a proper coaching program, and I think, what was it, first year of uni? I was one of your first guinea pigs, and Jesus, the absolute wild gains in my running and my strength, because obviously it was around that kind of powerlifting transitioning into running period of time. That was simultaneously the strongest and fastest I'd ever been, ever, conceivably, and that's when I started getting those sub 9 minute PFAs.
PFAs.
So for in normal terms, it's a 1.5 mile run, best effort. After 2 minutes of push-ups, 2 minutes of sit-ups. God, it's wild how I had to drag that out of my brain. It's been so long since I've thought
been a
about
while.
it.
Yeah,
it's been a while. But no, that was so interesting. And what I love is the absolute hop, skip, and jump that you just went between serious sports, which normally take up decades of people's life. But it follows a kind of philosophy that I love, where you get into something, you probably get about 80% of the way towards mastery, which doesn't take that long, and then you take a lot of the benefits from it, and then you can just apply it elsewhere. That's how I feel like my entire life has been, just trying all these different things, getting reasonably competent at it, and then just swanning off into the sunset. But you're mentioning Welbeck. It was really interesting that they came to your school, because I don't think I ever actually asked you how you managed to, how you got there. And it's not something that you really asked people. It's just, we were all just there.
Everybody came in the same way you did.
Yeah. Like for me, I went to the Army recruitment office in Chelmsford. This is before they shut that. This is years and years ago. I think it was the day I turned 15. Oh no, sorry. I was 15 in 4 months, and they were like, sorry chap, like you've got to wait until 15 in 7. So I waited all those months. And on the day I turned 15 in 7 months, I applied online, and then had to go back in for an interview. And then we were just chatting, and they were like, oh, you're doing your A-level. You seem to be like, quite keen on maths and science. And they just funneled me down that pipeline, which is just so interesting how these things happen. And for anyone that doesn't know, if I've not talked about it before, Welbeck, it was the Defence Sixth Form College, and it was basically, as Kieran said, the feeder. It was an officer pipeline for technical officers in the armed forces. And I think it was a really positive thing. It made a huge impact on my life. It was the perfect boiling pot of so many different factors. But that's how we met. Kieran was actually the vice head of college, or the head boy, effectively, before I was, which is kind of funny. We've always had this.
Took my place, yeah.
Yeah, we've always had this relationship where, like, I feel like I've just kind of followed what you've done, and then once you actually went to Sandhurst, obviously I got injured and couldn't, and then I just started living vicariously through you.
Yeah, just my 6 monthly updates of what we were doing.
But I think it'd be really valuable to just understand more about, you kind of brushed over it, but the arduous courses for me, in terms of, if we're thinking about high performance, that the fact that obviously you've completed one, and you, as an officer, it's slightly more difficult because they thrash you a little bit harder, but more so the fact that you've coached so many athletes through a pass, which there's, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've got your P company, so going to airborne units, you've got your all arms, going to the commando units, and then you've got your divers. Those are the three main ones, right?
Divers is a bit more niche because it's engineers only. It's well known within their world, not so well known throughout. It's actually, I would put it in a similar category because it's harder fizz than a lot of people realize, particularly on the outside. The other sort of like what people would refer to as the trifecta is essentially P Company, All Arms Commando, and then the Special Forces side. They're sort of like the three main big ones. And then you have a lot of other smaller cadres for some of the more niche, really interesting units. So, for example, the Pathfinders, quite a famous unit within 16 Brigade. They've got their own sort of niche pathway. There's a few others in the artillery and other units that have their own little pathway. So I think of it as three broad categories. So things like, for example, the Pathfinder's cadre is similar in structure or demands to Special Forces, for example, just in terms of what it looks like, not necessarily in terms of level or anything like that, or without going into too much detail. But yeah, you've essentially got three broad camps of courses.
Okay. And I actually didn't know there was more than that, so that's pretty interesting. I think I'm going to start showing my my lack of expertise. And when you're coaching athletes through this, you know, what are the most important aspects that you need to build up in them, both athletically and, you know, resilience-wise or mental-wise, I guess?
So the single biggest one, and you can see this from a mile off, is simply respect for the course. In terms of, if somebody comes to me 3 months out, if they don't have a very, very solid base, there's very little I can do in terms of, I can peak their running. I could put them on a program that is going to bring what they've got, their current capacity, to a head and sharpen that edge. But if they don't have what it takes to pass 3 months out, they're not going to. There's very little you can do in 12 weeks in terms of improving someone's resilience. You think about, sure, you can run faster, you might get a little bit stronger in that period, but you're not actually going to do anything to improve the resilience of all the smaller structures, the tendons, ligaments, bones, the elements that actually cause somebody to fail these courses. If you get stress fractures in your feet or your shins, for example, that's game over. And there's very little you can do in 3 months to combat that. So it's all about respecting the course in terms of your timelines. If somebody comes to me 6 months out, that's a whole different ballgame. All of a sudden now, we can definitely ramp up somebody's impact and therefore increasing their resilience and tolerance to impact. Because a lot of people are scared of this idea of impact. They think low impact is better. And you almost get this idea of low impact, good, impact, bad. And in reality, there's no way to train for a high impact course through low impact methods. And that seems so reasonable to say, and yet so many people forget it. And of course, low impact training is a very important element, and we use it to increase somebody's volume. But the single biggest factor holding people back in any of these courses for most people is injury. And if you try and take this idea that you can train for these courses without impact, all that these people do is shift their injury risk from training, because obviously a lot of people overtrain, for example, and they end up hurting themselves in training. All you do is shift your injury risk from training to the course itself because you're underprepared for it. So if anybody listening is in the boat where they want to go for one of these courses, the single biggest piece of advice I can give you outside of improving any element of fitness or hitting certain standards or anything is simply to give these courses the time that they deserve. And for most people, that is going to be 6 months minimum. I like to work with people for an absolute minimum of 6 months to know that I'm going to be able to get them in a good place in terms of their resilience to impact, and ideally longer. A lot of my clients who have had the best results were over a year in the making, in terms of, particularly for some of the harder courses the British Army has to offer, or other forces. I've worked with a few from around the world now, and those people often worked with me for, say, 12, 18 months. And in some cases more. I've got one lad who I've been working with nigh on 2 years now, and he's an absolute beast. And yeah, when it comes time to go on his course, he's not going to be found wanting, that's for sure.
And that's such an interesting point, actually, is that there's a commitment beyond the initial kind of bravado of saying, oh, I can do that, I'm going to do that. It's because obviously to understand, to go even to tier 1 or to go on selection, you're dedicating a huge chunk of your life, the entirety of it, because you are then a product of that capabilities demand, I guess would be a good way of saying that. And actually, that commitment needs to start a year minimum or 2 years before. But what's curious is, and I appreciate the explanation, by the way, because I just find it really interesting. But what's curious is, I feel like in a civilian context, that's reflected in bigger events. If you're thinking about, I'm just trying to think of big events, like Beyond the Ultra, Beyond the, you know what I mean? Beyond the Ultimate, I think, is the brand, but they do those 250-kilometer races. Obviously, Ironman's a pretty classic. Well, in fact, you coached me through my Ironman.
Yeah.
And there's a parallel here, and I'm going to fully hold my hands up and say they're not comparable in terms of difficulty or value or anything like that, but in terms of the physical aspect of preparedness, because ultimately, like, to use the Ironman as an example, being under your own steam for 12 to 14 hours, and it's a huge amount of strain and impact on the body, and that you just can't substitute actual impact and miles under your feet for that, can you?
I think the best comparison is the marathon, because it's such an easy thing for somebody to say, I'm going to do a marathon. And people so often use it. And you know what? We're probably recording this at a good time of year where people are potentially starting to look to what they're going to do post-Christmas. And it's so common, New Year's resolutions. I'm going to get in shape. I'm going to book a marathon. And the issue is, for so many people where they don't have the base of training, is that it is such a mammoth undertaking for a lot of people. If you're more sedentary, a marathon is no joke. It's no joke for anybody that's well conditioned and fit and been running for a long time. But if you're going from couch to marathon, that is a very, very serious undertaking. And so many people that we work with, particularly Omnia, come to us because they've tried to do these big events on their own, or they've done them in too short a time period, they've got hurt, or they've had to sacrifice the other things they enjoy. The analogy I always use is that there is, to complete any of these events, and I'm not talking about winning or, there is an absolute minimum level of fitness you have to complete these events. And if your start state is X and you need to get to Y, the shorter time period you give yourself, the steeper that curve or that ramp to get there is. The longer you give yourself, the more gradual that can be and the more things you can include and enjoy. Now, if you're a complete beginner and you only give yourself, say, 6 months to get from couch to marathon or couch to Ironman, you better make that your entire life if you want to get there safely. Like, you don't have room, particularly the Ironman example where you've got 3 sports to train for. If you have other things going on in your life, you better be prepared to put them on seriously on the back burner, or just say goodbye to them for 6 months, because you've given yourself such little time to get there. And it's that, I don't want to say lack of respect, because a lot of people, it's not a negative thing that they've booked these events. It's often the done thing now. It seems to be what people do on social media and things like that. So you can't blame these people for not necessarily understanding, because there's so many people now that post about Ironmans with no prep or minimal prep, and you see it everywhere. So
as raw dogging it.
Yeah, exactly. As naive as it is, you can't really blame these people for not understanding the undertaking, or perhaps you can, but whole other story. Do some research of what you're getting into. But I think it's just important to respect that distance, and that's where so much of this comes in. And particularly if you want to, going back to the whole hybrid thing, if you want to include other things alongside that, particularly if you want to be pushing your strength and you want to stay injury free, you better give yourself a nice long ramp.
You know what? I think that's actually raised a really, really, really important point, where if you're going to approach, I mean, we'll keep this to a physical context, but I think it's widely applicable. If you're going to approach any significant undertaking, whatever that is relative to you, number one, you've got to respect X discipline, X, undertaking. Like, respect it, humble yourself, and say that, you're not just on the drop of a hat going to be able to do it. Give yourself the time, and then make sure you're training for the thing with the thing. Exactly as you said. I think because social media allows us to take things out of context. For example, objectively, strongman training is probably dreadful for your long-term, joint health. However, well, sorry, that's a massive broad, but you know what I mean? Like, you know, certain things are probably not good for your disc health, for example, in your spine. However, if you're going to do a strongman event, you need to train for fucking strongman. Like,
Funnily enough,
and
the thing builds resilience. Yeah.
yeah,
You look at
and
a
that's
lot
a
of the,
really, really
sorry.
good point.
Yeah, you look at a lot of
Sorry.
the best stone lifters in the world. They do things that the average person who has always been taught to never lift with a rounded back or protect your back at all costs. You look at the best stone lifters in the world, it is simply not possible because of the sheer mass of these stones to lift them with a straight back. It's an inherent and important part of that lift to bend your back. You cannot complete the movement correctly without lifting with a bent back. And that will blow some people's minds. But funnily enough, there's a point where, you know, I don't lift up a shopping bag with a perfectly straight back. And I don't think many other people would. So we can, in our minds, we can kind of comprehend that there must be some sort of threshold below which, oh, lifting with a bent back is fine. Like nobody, more extreme example, nobody picks up a book with a perfectly straight back and braces with their legs and says they have to lift a book that way. So clearly in our minds, we've got some kind of threshold. So if there's a point below which you can lift with a bent back, for example, then surely you can lift that threshold higher and higher through training. And that's exactly what strongman or strongwoman athletes do. They essentially, if you start with, say, a 40 kilo sandbag or a 60 kilo atlas stone, for example, and you build some strength in that position and then you keep moving up and up and up, you can do some truly, truly crazy things. And at the last Ardmay weekend, we were up in Scotland with Omnia, and we brought some of the Omnia athletes with us. We had Liam, who's one of the best sort of lightweight stone lifters in the world. And honestly, I cannot tell you what it was like watching these mammoth weights, sandbags and stones, just getting absolutely ragdolled. And the strength that he's got in these compromised positions is incredible. And it's the kind of thing, exactly what you're saying there. You would think that would be terrible for you, but it's the complete opposite because he's built up to that. It's built resilience through reps and practice. Funnily enough, the body gets better at what we ask it to. So yeah, it's somewhat, I don't want to say counterintuitive, but it's surprising. You look at it on the surface and you think, there's no way that's good for you. And before you know it, because you've trained it and you've built up to it, you can do things that most people would consider incomprehensible.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to achieve any of the top, 0 point percentiles in anything, you're going to have to do things that the vast majority are not willing to do as well. But it just raises that point, like, I think it requires context, obviously, and I think that's the thing that probably social media in terms of fitness lacks the most is context, because you can't make mass generalizations, i.e., like I did, that strongman's bad for your back, because it requires you to be somewhat trained for that movement. And yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, actually, and it's really interesting to discuss with someone knowledgeable at the extremes. By the way, that weekend sounded absolutely class. Like that sounds so manly. Like I bet there was whiskey and general Scottishness thrown around afterwards, which would be fun.
Can confirm a lot of Scottish.
A lot of Scottishness, whatever that is. So I'd love to talk just from an entrepreneurial standpoint. Obviously, it's clear that throughout your life, and obviously a big part of your career, team has really been at the foundation of your success and what you have desired. And obviously, for those who don't know, who are listening, Kieran, whilst doing a very, very, very demanding full-time role, in one of the most demanding positions that the Army has in 16th Brigade, you started to build what became a very popular coaching company. And obviously, when you left the Army, you decided to join Omnia, and we've discussed, because it was one of the best, in my opinion. But tell us about that process of kind of leaving whilst juggling all these things beforehand, and entrepreneurially, what was that like?
Yeah. So I guess a bit of context here is that I've always been extremely, extremely long-term focused in terms of playing the long game. So don't know how much you remember. I actually came up with the name. So my old business was called Invictus Performance. I came up with that at Welbeck. this has been my plan for so long. And I built up that Instagram page for the business and the initial coaching, all of that through college and then university. So it was a really, really slow burn. And what that meant was that the brand that was Invictus Performance, it had put out probably at that point, before I started monetizing anything, probably about 5 years of free content. So people knew it, they knew I wasn't selling anything, and they trusted it. A lot of people had used what I was putting out there to train for initial officer training and all of the different services. So it had a lot of trust. And it meant when I launched properly, because obviously, as we've mentioned, I coached you through uni and a few others, everything was a bit off the cuff. It wasn't very formal or well put together. Once I did everything properly and I launched the business officially when I was still serving in 16 Brigade, it absolutely took off to the point where it was beyond our wildest expectations of what was going to happen. You know, I had planned to be in the army for another, call it 5 to 10 years. I thought that's how long it was going to take all of these kind of things to reach ahead. What actually happened was I decided to play life on hard mode and make things as difficult for myself as I could, because I thought the business was going to be a slow burn and therefore I was going to have time to do a degree alongside it. So not only did I have 16 Brigade and the business, I'm also in the final year of a strength and conditioning degree. Now, I thought all of that was going to be manageable. How ridiculous that sounds now in hindsight is hilarious. But I think it's important to remember that I had no idea the business was going to do as well as it did. And in sort of 18 months, 2 years, it was objectively very, very successful, and it was profitable from day one, which was very, very cool. We essentially had enough signups on day one to cover all bills, all software, and literally from the get-go, it was profitable, which was a very nice position to be in. So I had a lot of people say, well, if you've reached this point in 18 months of part-time work, why on earth are you sort of folding your own business side of it to work with Omnia? And what people often can't understand is that it was a no-brainer for me. There wasn't actually a moment of doubt. It was, once I had this opportunity, I'd known Fergus online for years, and we chatted back and forth over the years. We'd done a lot of similar challenges, and yeah, we had just known each other in that space for a long time. And when this opportunity came up, exactly what we've been talking about, it was the opportunity to have a team and people better than me. I'm now surrounded by coaches who are far more experienced and have been in the industry longer than me. So I have people to learn from. When you're running your own business, sure, you've got mentors, you can pay, business mentors, or you can go chat to people who are other coaches or whatnot, but actually working in a team with co-workers, far more experienced and better than myself. I've seen more development as a coach working for Omnia in 6 months versus 2 years of running it by myself. And when you look at the long game there, that really, really is a no-brainer. If I'm getting that much development in 6 months, sure, it may no longer be mine, quote unquote, but like, if you don't care about that, if all I care about is being the best coach I can be, and again, thinking about that long-term goal, why would I do anything other than grab this opportunity to work with the absolute best by both, with both hands? So yeah, might seem counterintuitive to put what was objectively a very successful business on the back burner, but when you take it with the context of everything else, it really, really does make sense and was just a no-brainer for me.
No, 100%. And I think the thing that resonates throughout that entire story, for one, is you have an incredible degree of humility with everything that you do, and this isn't just in our conversation today. It's across who you are as a person. You're incredibly humble with the fact that you were literally one of the first people ever. Like, obviously, Fergus popularized it, and I'm a massive fan of Fergus. He popularized the 5-minute 5, or the 500-5. Sorry, you were literally one of the first people to do that, and to understand what the 500 is, was it a 500-pound deadlift directly into a sub 5-minute mile? Which what's the kilometer splits on that, like per kilometer?
It's just under a 3:05 minute kilometer, so it's really quite fast. It's when I first
honking.
Yeah, when I first had a go at it, it really does feel like you're just sprinting for a mile. A 3-minute kilometer is pretty fast. I actually first heard about the challenge. So Alex Viada's original book, The Hybrid Athlete, this challenge was mentioned in the foreword of it. It was originally proposed in some of the old CrossFit literature of what would be the most complete athlete. And he was talking about this in the foreword. And it's one of those things that stayed in my mind ever since. Now, I first read Alex's first book when I was 17, I actually read it at college. And
Wow.
that's how sort of long I've been involved in the quote unquote hybrid space. And I hate saying that because it makes you sound like, oh no, I was here before it was cool. But it's for a bit of context, that's where these challenges come from. You know, obviously it's only exploded in the last few years, and people hear now certain people or certain big names in the industry call themselves a hybrid athlete or whatever, and they think it's this new trend. But you know, Alex had this published book when I was 10 years ago, when you know I was 17, 18, so 9, 10 years ago. That's how long this idea has been around for, you know, pushing these challenges. So yeah, it's one of those. It's a lot of people don't understand the context there behind these.
Yeah, if I'm honest with you, you know, as someone who, you know, quote unquote would at least relate to that kind of identity with in terms of what I enjoy doing with my fitness time, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. You know, I've definitely heard of it. I think he deserves a shout out. What is he on social media?
Yeah, Alex Viada he's on social media, and he's got a book on pre-order at the moment. Actually, funnily enough, before we jumped on the call, it was actually what I was doing. I was completing my pre-order of his new book. So Alex Viada is the OG in this space, and unfortunately vastly sort of unknown compared to some of the bigger, shoutier names. Because obviously in the fitness industry, it's not about how much you know, it's about how loud you shout or how sick your abs are. Unfortunately, which is a shame, but. Yeah, the absolute OG in this space, and I certainly wouldn't be anywhere near as competent in this field if I hadn't read his book. I don't think so. Even we joke about when I was fat as a powerlifter, I still was passing army fitness tests. Sure, I wasn't, you know, I wasn't a top 1%er in running, but there aren't many national level powerlifters that were still passing army fitness tests. And by my own standards, I wasn't very fit, but objectively, I was still pretty fit, and that's only because of the methods that I learned from this book originally. So I owe a lot to that original methodology, and it's molded and shaped a lot of my own coaching practice and what I've gone on to learn since. But I really like that 505 because it really nicely demonstrates what so many people in this space call themselves hybrid can and can't do, in terms of a huge amount of the people that are now big names in this space, they're not actually very strong. And this is the issue, in that so many of these people don't necessarily understand true hybrid programming. They are simply people who are big and strong. Perhaps they were bodybuilders, perhaps they were powerlifters, and now they've cut down the body fat. And we both know that maintaining a quality is far easier than building it. So it's very, very easy to maintain strength, maintain size whilst getting fitter. What is exponentially harder is getting fitter and stronger at the same time. And that's why so few people have accomplished some of these challenges. There are an absolute minority of people that have pulled off the 500-pound deadlift and 5-minute mile in the same day challenge. And there are far fewer still who've done that with a squat. And off the top of my head, I think it's probably less than it might even be less than 5 that I know of anyway. There's very, very few people that have put this challenge out there. And to me, it's a really nice separator, because so many of these people calling themselves hybrid, if we go back to that original definition of pushing the 2 or more elements of fitness that don't complement each other directly hard, they're only pushing one of them. They're not actually particularly strong at all. And that's very telling. In a lot of these people now entering the industry can't help beginners do the same. So many people, there's a lot of pushback. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a lot of pushback at the moment. Obviously, the hybrid space has exploded, and now there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's not realistic. It's not true. It's all these people were bodybuilders first, and now they're putting in mediocre run times and calling themselves hybrid." You know, because that is what a huge amount of the space is, and it's only a tiny minority of people that are actually helping beginners run fast and lift heavy. Just to use those 2 examples at the same time. It's the forgotten element.
I think it's a really important distinction, though, because obviously, objectively, you know, having a bodybuilding background and wanting to introduce, because this is what happens a lot, isn't it? Having a strength or a bodybuilding background and then introducing more cardiovascular elements is objectively for them, for their physique, their health, great. But I think a really important point that you mentioned is your ability to help a beginner do that in a competent way that's going to not, negatively impact their health. And I think that's a really, really important distinction, because, I don't, obviously I'm not in the space, I kind of have dabbled in and around it, but as an athlete, not as a coach. And objectively, from my perspective, I think the more people that are running and lifting is good.
Exactly.
But obviously, as a coach, where you need to draw the line is, are you using this as a marketing term, or do you believe in the ideology behind it? And I'm really, really glad that you've educated me on the Alex Vieira. Shout out Alex Vieira.
Viada.
Viada, sorry. Sorry, shout out Alex Viada. Him watching this.
Yeah.
But no, just because, like, in terms of, obviously, I think our early conversations is how I came to understand the terminology and, what hybrid is. Popularized, in terms of popularization, for me, it's Fergus. Fergus was one of the earlier influencers who, at least, built my trust, and also the scope for what was possible. But I think it's really, really important to have a direct link back to that original, because I'd never heard of him. Like, there's other bigger names like Ollie Marchand who comes to mind, etc. But no, I really appreciate that. And something else I was going to mention earlier is, to be the best, you need to be surrounded by the best, and having an environment where you are literally forced to grow out of not wanting to be, just to be able to keep up and obviously compete and be competitive with those around you, I think is a really, really important thing to cultivate in your environment. I mean, that's one thing business-wise, or at least mindset-wise, that I found really positive about, being in Dubai. I'm sure you found the same with London. I feel like the same kind of community is being developed in Edinburgh. I don't know. I know that you go between London and Edinburgh quite a lot. But just being surrounded by people who are like-minded and who have the scope of vision to see life for something bigger than it, that it could be bigger than it is,
Yeah, it's so important. I first had my true exposure to this at places like Sandhurst and in my first unit, for example, in terms of, well, obviously, I mean, we spoke about the powerlifting team and things like that in terms of strength, but my first sort of eye-opener, I guess, was at my first unit, where I've turned up very fit. Objectively, I was a fit person. Run time's not quite where they are now. I'm fitter now, but still objectively very good runner and pretty strong too. And I've turned up at my first unit, and there are 15 plus guys who can run laps around me. And all the way through, I've had people who I knew no matter what, I'm not chasing them. I'm not going to be able to beat them. Or sorry, I'm always chasing them. I'm never going to be able to beat them. And I cannot tell you how hard I've pushed myself, or particularly, we often talk about in fitness breakthrough sessions where, let's say, running's a really good example, where no matter what, you don't feel like you can ever break through certain paces, and then you do it once, and all of a sudden you have this weight lifted from you. And I had a really, really sort of potent example where, in my own training, I'm a big fan of 800-meter intervals. I think they have so much carryover to every distance, and I realize there's a lot of, I've just lost a whole lot of the audience there. They all think I'm a psychopath.
No, I remember doing fucking hundreds of 800-meter intervals during the Ironman train.
They're special. There's something really, really special about the 800-meter distance, and I've always been a big fan of them. But I could only ever hold, let's call it, say, a free 20-minute kilometer. Still pretty quick, but in training with enough rest, I just couldn't really seem to push my own training averages when you're doing, say, 6 or 8 of them below that. We then had a session, and it was a pretty, quite frankly, poorly constructed session. It was just a classic sort of army session. Right, best effort, 800 meters, then you get 60 seconds recovery, and you're going again. And it's obviously, we both know 60 seconds recovery is not enough after a best effort. It just isn't. Yeah. And we were doing this all session. And before I knew it, I was looking at my watch. I'm running far, far faster than I was able to with more rest and training on my own, just because I was chasing people. And it was this breakthrough session for me where I'm like, oh, well, actually, I'm able to do this on much less rest than I thought I needed, and I'm running faster. And it, as I keep saying, it's a breakthrough. It really is. It opens up your eyes to what's possible, and that's only because I was chasing people. Because I had people who were absolute rockets, and I've got a few friends who I'm still really close to, and if you think I'm fit, my God, I look at them and I think they are something else. How on earth does somebody move that quick? And I'm sure there's people they looked up to. There really are levels to this game, and there is always somebody to look up to. Unless you're Kipchoge or Tadej Pogacar, like there is always somebody to look up to.
100%. And even when you get to that level, they start looking across at other sports, and I think that's really the true sign of humility from them as a generational athlete, as a world-class athlete. Is, one of my favorite things is when they're in conversation, they'll be like, yeah, but it's nothing compared to XYZ being able, somewhat, Pogacar, maybe mentioning the fact that he could, his deadlift is nowhere near Hafthor Bjornsson's or something like that. But I can't remember where I was going with that point, but yeah, it's a really, really oh yeah. So I completely understand what you mean. The only time I've ever cracked, a sub 8:30 mile and a half was at Welbeck at like 6 o'clock in the morning. And one of the fastest people in my year was running. And obviously there was no pressure. I just started my watch, was going. And then I just, for whatever reason, decided to hit fuck it. And I just chased him. I threw up afterwards. But that was the fastest I'd ever run. I wasn't able to replicate it again, but it enabled me to break the 9-minute threshold.
Yeah.
So I know, and I've got so many examples of that. But I know exactly what you mean. There's something different about being in like competition. But there was something else I wanted to mention or talk about from that, and it's escaping me. Oh yeah, so. In terms of, this is going to be more of like an opinion thing because I'm just interested. What do you think is the most difficult athletic, if we're talking about world athletics, what do you think is the most difficult, track discipline?
Are we talking about running only?
Yeah, running only.
In my opinion, it really is. The longer you go, you think about how long you're in the locker for in something like a marathon, compared to, sure, objectively, like in terms of the acute pain, something like an 800 meter or 400 meter hurdle, they're often chosen as sort of like the most painful distances. But you think about how long you're in the locker for if you're pushing competitive marathon pace versus any other discipline. And having pushed both to an objectively reasonably high level, endurance sports are so much harder than strength sports in terms of what they demand from you. They really are. And in my opinion, there's just no competition there whatsoever. People take the example of like a 20 rep squat, for example. That is nothing compared to the suffering of trying to PB a 10K or something. It really, really isn't. The amount of opportunities you have to quit when you're pushing yourself hard for 40 minutes versus the 2 minutes it might take you to do a 20 rep set. There's so many more opportunities for that little quitting demon to whisper in your ear, and you've got to fight that off so many more times. There's just no comparison. So in my opinion, the longer you push the event, and this is obviously as the opinion of somebody that hasn't competed in every track and field event, for example, but just objectively, endurance sports are harder than strength sports, and I'll hear no argument to the contrary there.
That's such an interesting perspective, that the most difficult would be the longest, in that you have the most opportunity to listen to that little demon to quit. That's so interesting. I've never actually thought about it like that, because probably naively, like, I would have just gone about categorizing it as what has been the physically most painful experience of my life. And I'd say for me personally, it's in and around that 800 meter to 1500 meter or 800 to 1600 meter level, because, by the back end of the second lap, you can't feel your lips, you can't feel your hands, you're like like wheezing all over the shop, or at least I would be. But that's a really, really interesting. Yeah, actually, the worst, that makes a lot of sense. Worst day of my life was getting mild heat stroke on that marathon halfway through, because I had to finish it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
You think about what that. Yes, it wasn't as acutely painful as sending an 800-meter interval, but what buried you the most? 10 minutes later after an 800-meter interval, you can still feel it. Just maybe you're still on the floor, but 10 minutes after finishing an Ironman where you've got heat stroke through, you're no better. Think of it that way, or the
yeah,
effect it has on
and
your body. And
your recovery is measured in days after that,
yeah,
as
yeah.
opposed
Well,
to minutes or hours. Yeah,
for
that's a really,
true
really good point.
ultra distance endurance like an Ironman, realistically, you're probably not a baseline for multiple weeks. It really, really does have that kind of impact on you. And sure, acute, like you think about some of the really, really disgusting events. So, for example, the hour record in cycling, max distance in an hour, probably objectively the most painful record there is. Or
Yeah,
you look at the stats for what they hold for an hour, and it's one of those things where you can't truly appreciate what they're doing until you've held that pace for a minute or so in an interval. Or to be honest, genuinely most people couldn't hold the hour record for a minute. A lot of people would struggle to actually get their bike up to the pace that they hold. It's genuinely unfathomable. And of course, those shorter distance records are extremely, extremely painful. But yeah, just the longer you go, I just think of it as the more opportunities you have to quit and not fulfill your potential in that event.
and I do find that there's an interesting tipping point. I wonder whether it does sit. It probably just sits at pace and like level of competition. But for example, I know that you've done a 70-mile ultra with kit. In a military context. Is it the Lanyard Trophy? Is that right?
Yeah, it ends up being about 70 kilometers.
Oh,
Just
sorry, 70K.
before anybody calls me a Walton and says that I'm making it sound like it's harder than it is. But the race as it's meant to be is 40 miles as the crow flies. So realistically, the race ends up being, call it 45 miles. If you get lost,
Okay.
maybe 50. But yeah, you're carrying kit, always somewhere over rough terrain, and it's very, very good event for anybody still surfing, particularly in the signals. Go get involved. It's an amazing, amazing event.
Yeah. So, well, sorry, I apologize for mismiling it. But it's still nearly, coming up on at least 1.5 times a marathon. And you've won that event. I think you're not going to say it, so I'll say it. But I think there's an interesting balance point, because any time that I've done ultra distance stuff, for me, there's like less of a pressure because I drop the pace right down, because you're settling in for the long run. And yes, subjectively, it's like a level 3 pain, but it's fucking for like half a day, as opposed to, like a marathon would be like, maybe a level 6, but it's 3-4 hours. I do wonder if there's like a catch point between, but then the argument would be, well, you've got the 100-kilometer world record, which I think off the top of my head is like just a scratch under 4-minute kilometers, which is disgusting. It's absolutely obscene is the right word.
Even the 100-mile record is something mental. I can't remember the pace. I'm not going to try and quote it, but it's the kind of pace that most people would be very happy to run once in the 5K, and it's being run continuously for 100 miles. It's genuinely sickening.
It's obscene, I think, is a wonderful way to categorize that. But obviously, I know that Omnia has a big tradition of, and Fergus specifically has a big tradition of doing these obscene challenge. Obscene is a great word, but these obscene challenges, and he's obviously got the tenacity coming up. 10 Ironmans in 10 days for mental health.
Yeah,
is there anything that in 10 cities? Yeah, is there anything that you're working towards at the moment?
In terms of massive events, not really. For me, I've really, really fallen in love with cycling, and I did a number of, they're called crits, or it's short for criterium racing. It's basically circuit racing, sort of less than an hour, very, very focused on riding with the bunch, a lot of sprints, a lot of accelerations out of corners. It's extremely, extremely fun. It's about as much fun as I know how to have on a bike, and did a number of those with the army, and now looking to do my first season next summer. So just cycling as much as I can, trying to be as strong as I can. And I found a huge amount of benefit of cycling on my running. So I'm just maintaining my running through sort of minimum volume and allowing the cycling to do the legwork, for, pardon the pun, on my running, as it were. and just kind of, I've got some unfinished business with running. In terms of certain distances and milestones, I've got a number of PBs that are close to certain minutes, for example, and I want to tick those off into the next minute. And then lo and behold, the second I get there, of course, goalposts are going to shift again. It's that never-ending slope, isn't it? But yeah, for now, no massive events, mainly sort of big sportives, they're called in cycling. So organized races, usually somewhere beautiful, often with a lot of climbing, going up a mountain or somewhere like that. So I've got a number of those booked, doing some sportives across Europe, and then as much cycling as I can get in, really. Yeah, for now, no sort of crazy 250-mile ultras or anything mental like that. It just takes too much out of, like I said, I'm coming into my third year of a degree at the moment, and I needed to be sensible. And to be honest, I'm quite impressed with myself here for not putting something stupid in the calendar, because I'm really bad for it. As you can probably gather from starting a business and a degree in the same year, I'm pretty prone to biting off silly amounts and then having to find a way to make it work. And I wanted to actually be able to put some time and effort into the degree. So no Ironmans or crazy runs this year, just because that's the other thing with things like crits, you can do quite well off not much training per week. So I can train a fairly normal amount and still have plenty of time for my coaching and my degree. So yeah, call this a development year and being sensible, a maturity year.
No, 100%. And I actually think that it's quite funny you mentioned that, because when I coach high performers, and something I actually have to often with with the stick, not the carrot, do is convince people not to bite off more than they can chew, because that is the tendency. And I think that obviously I've mentioned, you've got an incredible ability to remain humble, and I think realistic and mature about things is probably one of your best, attributes as well. And I'm actually glad to hear that you've managed to strike some kind of work-life training balance. I was going to include training and work, but it's not. It's like it's a whole lifestyle for you. But I'm very glad to hear. And if we say beyond this year, is there anything like, is there any targets that are up on the wall that you're waiting to collect eventually?
Ironman just has to happen, of course, at some point. But again, it's not something I'm in any rush to do. And for me, a lot of it is, the whole point of this for me is getting out in beautiful places and exploring the mountains and all these amazing settings that certain races take place in, for example. So for me, I would love to go do some of the really sort of massive sportives, or for example, you can go do races where you essentially follow one of the stages of the Tour de France, for example. Things like that, amazing. Obviously got some unfinished business with, or I say unfinished, I've never really even attempted, in terms of certain milestones in running that I'd love to hit, like the 3-hour marathon, for example. Something that aerobically I know I should be able to do, and I would just need to put in a prep for it. And certain 10K and 5K times, for example, I'd love to hit. But yeah, to be honest, most of my long-term goals are all on the endurance side now. I've got no real desire to push many of my strength numbers much higher with what it took for my body the first time, and how it takes away from the things that I enjoy now. Obviously, our interests shift over time. There was a point in my life, particularly when I was younger, where I thought all I wanted to be was this 100-kilogram pavement cracking absolute unit that could deadlift 300 kilos. And I've realized that to deadlift 300 kilos, it would take so much away from my life that I enjoy. Nobody who deadlifts 300 kilos is, or certainly the absolute minority, if they do exist, out doing massive runs or cycles or things like that. So yeah,
at least natural athletes, 100%. That's not on the cards.
Yeah, and
at least at that weight, yeah.
That's something that's quite important for me as well, because regardless of my own personal choices or ethics, I'm essentially forced to be lifelong natural, because obviously taking a lot of drugs predisposes you to things like tendon injuries. And with some of my existing tendon injuries, for me to hop on drugs would be the stupidest decision I could make for my own longevity and sort of injury risk that I could possibly make. So I've obviously got an unrepairable bicep tear on my right arm, and I'm right-handed. If the other tendon goes, I've really, really made a massive mistake there. So for me, getting on drugs is the stupidest idea I could possibly have, to be honest.
That's so interesting because, by the way, like I'm glad you mentioned this because I feel like the whole like natural conversation is a bit of a weird one, specifically in
Yeah,
the hybrid space.
yeah,
Um, because obviously it's popularized and massively common in the bodybuilding space. I've actually only really just come around to understand it. Like I heard the first, like, because a lot of fitness, you know, coaching, business mastermind type spaces. Obviously, there's a lot of bodybuilding coaches, and I heard I heard the term assisted athlete for the first time like 18 months ago.
yeah.
And anyway, we digress. I've never actually thought about the fact that obviously you can't, like, as much as you can build resilience into your tendons and the your bones and stuff, but like you can't match the speed and the pace
Exactly. That's it.
if you're using assistance. That's a really, really interesting point. But plus, obviously, you've come from an environment of the military, which that isn't possible, into like competing in, you know, cycling, which
Yeah.
I'd presume if you want to go anywhere with that, you can't do it
Exactly.
anyway. So that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those where, exactly as you've mentioned, if you take drugs, the speed of development in your muscles drastically outpaces the supporting structures, and that is a recipe for disaster. The simplest. So my bicep tear, for context, was not sport related. It was a parachuting accident, but
So cool.
it's pretty rare stuff. Like I don't know many people that have done it that way. It's always a pretty new one for physios when I tell them how I've done it. But you look at natural powerlifting, bicep tears in deadlifts are near unheard of. It's just not a thing. In natural powerlifting, so few people tear their bicep deadlifting. You look at strongman, it will happen every single year. You watch World's Strongest Man at Christmas, there will be so many people who tear their lat, who tear their bicep, because for context, World's Strongest Man is not drug tested. It is a part of the sport, and it is not cheating to use drugs. So, they are all on steroids, and it's not cheating, it's just part of the sport. An inherent part of that is just look at the strain they're putting through their body. How many of them will tear a quad straight off the bone, or will literally rip their lat off the attachment. It's so common compared to natural sports. So yeah, very, very dumb for me. But also, exactly as you mentioned, I guess I've been very lucky in that all through uni I was competing in tested sport. So there was never that temptation to do anything, and all the people I looked up to, they were competing in clean sport. And the exact same in the army. I have so many role models who are fitter than me, who I know have got there without drugs. I'm sure there are some people in the army who get caught out or do these things, but the vast majority don't. And I know for a fact the people I look up to don't. And I think it's just a case of you shifting expectations. And the longer you spend in elite sport, I've always hated this idea when people who have never had any kind of involvement in elite sport say all elite athletes are on drugs, because it's nonsense. It is complete and utter nonsense. And it's only said by those who've never experienced just what can happen if you train with a team for, say, 10 years. Like, I had this tiny little taste of, so for context, I went to 3 national championships and 1 university world championships in powerlifting. Very, very like sub-elite. I was not anything world-class at all, but I had this tiny taste of elite sport. And a lot of my friends in powerlifting are still in the sport. And I look up to some of them and I see how strong they are. And I know for a fact they're not on drugs. I've known them for years. They are so stupendously strong to the point where I guarantee a huge number of people would come across their Instagram page and think they're on drugs. But they don't realize what's gone into a decade plus of natural training. Or the hybrid space is a really, really good example of that, in that for many people, you might look at the fact that I have deadlifted 240 kilos and ran a sub 5-minute mile in the same day and think, well, I'm on drugs, I can't do that, therefore he must be on drugs, which is a pretty common accusation because drug use is far more common than people realize, particularly at sort of low levels. What people don't realize is that if you do something for 10 years, you're going to get pretty good at it. And particularly in the army, where running is, even if you never push it, we have no choice but to run every week. And you do something for 10, 11 years. I think I've been running, probably 13 years now, even though I've never pushed it. 13 years of near constant practice. That's going to make me pretty good at it. And if I needed drugs to get me to a 5-minute mile, I'd want a refund, because it's really not that impressive when you put it in the context of, like, can you imagine if it took me 13 years and drugs to run a 5-minute mile? That's really not a good return on investment. It's really not that impressive when you put it in the context of how long I've been training for these things. So I think so many people have this skewed expectation of what they can, or that these skewed limitations of what's possible drug free. They think that, and you know what, I've reflected on this quite a bit. I think a huge amount of the reason that people think that you need drugs to look a certain way is because we tell people about newbie gains. This idea that you get all of your gains in the first year or two, and it's complete and utter rubbish. Because how many people train to the best of their ability in the first year or two? None. Absolutely none. I made the vast majority of particularly my upper body, for example, I made the vast majority of my gains in the upper body in my last few years of training, not my first, because I didn't know about things like how to actually control the range of motion, how to really push myself, because pushing yourself is a learned skill. You watch a beginner in the gym, they don't have the motor skills to push themselves to true failure most of the time, or certainly not again. And you see it in endurance training, for example. If I put a brand new beginner on a treadmill and says, right, you're going to run your fastest ever 5K, their heart rate is not going to get anywhere close to mine, because I have this learned ability to hold a higher heart rate than they do, and dig deeper. It's a skill, and people forget this. And this idea that you do that in the beginning is complete rubbish. And I think that's where so much of it comes, because you get to say your 2-year point and you're nowhere near where you want to look like, and you think, well, I've been told I make the vast majority of my gains in the first 2 years. I'm nowhere near where I want to be. Surely they must be on drugs to get further. And they don't realize how long it takes to get to these places.
You know what? That is such a good point, in that I think if we roll that back to first principles of, what is it that people are being sold, and like, actually fundamentally, if it comes down to marketing, what do people want? They want more, faster. And I think often the drug accusation thing is a projection from that initial, marketing more, faster element, but also ultimately it's going to come from a place of jealousy, and jealousy reflects more on the individual who is kind of pointing it than it does ever on anyone else that it's pointed at, because it's just a reflection of their own inadequacy that they, exactly as you said, maybe are using or look in better shape but aren't achieving those results. That's a really interesting point. I think if we can separate bodybuilding from this, because I know nothing in the grand scheme of things, and I think that's an integral part of it. But extending this into sport, obviously you have a huge knowledge base here. Sorry, a side note. It's so funny how many people don't know that strongman is like literally just the Juice Olympics.
I have this conversation every year.
Because
people don't know.
Like, and I remember do you know the enhanced games, that whole thing? I love the concept, by the way. Like, I'm actually genuinely curious what human body is physically capable of, at the very upper limits with everything, do what was it, the compression chamber with the oxygen, do everything. I want to see what, can we run 7 seconds in 100 meters in 7 seconds? However, people are like, oh, we need like strength sports at the enhanced games, and someone was like, well, that's literally just strongman. Like, do you think that these people get that big naturally? Obviously they're enigmas. Brian Shaw, 1 in 500 million bone density, or Hafthor Bjornsson, one of the largest and also strongest humans that we know of. But so it's such a good take that this all stems from a marketing thing of more, better results, faster timeline. And then if you project that forwards 100%, you're going to create this idea that all of these things are manageable within smaller timeframes, because there's a big difference between saying all of these things are possible, which I'm a huge advocate for. Like, I obviously we have a coaching brand, the Wellness Club. Anytime I speak to someone who's never run before, or like maybe did a 5K once with their friend and it was the worst day of their life because they just sent it and had never run before, saying if you can run 1K, then you do that every week for 10 weeks, we're going to start making forward progress. You're not going to overtrain, etc. I just threw those numbers out, but it's conceivable that you'd be able to run a marathon, because if you can do 1K, you can do 2, you can probably do 5, extend that all the way up. But it's very different, and it needs to be distinguished that it's possible to do these things with the time frame, because that's obviously where expectations are not being met, jealousy creeps in, and then accusations spread. Really, really good point to make.
Yeah.
And I think obviously those listening might get a sense of this, but everything you've done athletically, and to be honest, professionally as well, you've always just committed yourself 100%. And I want to understand more about your mindset around how you actually think about these things when you're approaching something, or when you're at the degree, for example. How is it that you actually, what is your mindset like around these things? Like, when you're thinking about the results you want to get, or the fact that I know for a fact you'll have gone and read circles around the reading list and things like that, you're just putting 110% into everything you do. Like, I want to know more about the mindset, because obviously every aspect of what you've done over the last, presumably forever, because it sounds like it, but at least the last 10 years that we've kind of known each other, it's just, you've always aspired to do the best and compared yourself to the best. So that was a very long way of just wanting to know more about your mindset and how you approach things.
So I could sum it up really, really simply in that everything I've achieved is through not dropping a ball. That is it. It's not about the effort. It's not about doing something for 110% for 6 weeks and then falling off the wagon. The athletes who get the furthest, and we actually have good data on this, they're the ones who don't get injured. It's about being in the game. And I think I'm quite a good example of this, because obviously I've got, even though it's never ever been my primary focus, I've got quite a long history in running, for example. I've only achieved what I have because I've ran consistently for 13 years. And like I said, I've never pushed any of it particularly hard. Running has never been my 110% focus, because I'd have had to have, obviously I'm about 90 kilos. I'd have had to lose a huge amount of body weight, train a huge amount, and that would take my eye off the ball in other aspects. It's what quantity or effort of training can I do and still do everything else? And that was really important in the army, because the army is not like any other job where, even in peacetime, there are far more consequences if I didn't do my job properly compared to other jobs, because you have far more say over other people's careers and lives, and the responsibility that you have for those in your troop, or those you have command over, is absolutely massive. And the responsibility that you have to report on them correctly, for example, is far higher than in other jobs. And so it's a can't afford to fail kind of attitude. What's the most I can get away with in any one aspect without dropping the ball on the other? And that essentially is the only thing that has kept me in the game for all of these. I haven't ever gone 110% in on academics, because otherwise I would have had to drop the business. I've never gone 110% in on business, because then I probably would have had to leave the army earlier than I did. I've never gone 110% in on training, because then I'd be one of those people, we refer to them as tracksuit soldiers in the army, where you're never actually in work. You're just always off competing, and everybody else has to pick up the slack for your job. It's what can you do to just stay in the game as consistently as you can? Because again, bringing it back to that drug conversation, this is so much of what we achieve is in the long term. It's never ever in these short term stints. Nobody's built something incredible off, or very, very few, off say 6 months of going all in and burning every match. For most people, it takes decades to get to the point where they build something truly incredible, or particularly in business, it's never these overnight successes. And so much of it is just about doing the work consistently over a long enough time period for it to build into something incredible. And that, I think, is what so many people get wrong about fitness, business, success, anything. It's not about these heroic efforts in the short term. It's just finding a way to make it sustainable for you in the long term, so that you can do it for the rest of your life. If you look at something and say, well, you know what, I don't think I can maintain this. Well, how are you going to build anything great if you can't maintain it for, call it 2 years minimum, to do something truly incredible? Well, it's probably never going to amount to much, because realistically, what can you actually build in 6 months? Not a whole load. So to sum all that up, my mindset has always just been, how can I stay in this for the long haul? What can I do to keep myself moving forward as little by little for as long as I can? And that's it. It really is that simple.
What a fantastic way to surmise that. And I think what's interesting is immediately there was something in the back of my head that went, yeah, but you can achieve a lot in a shorter period of time, but that's 100% not what you were talking about. And I think, again, your story, if we kind of condense it down, is one of humility and longevity and responsibility. I think you've always taken long-term outcomes as the most important thing, and I really respect that, because it's so hard to do. It's so hard to think long-term in that respect, and I think people often confuse really good advice with what it takes to start as opposed to what it takes to get great. Because
Exactly.
100%, if I'm telling someone about how they can get started on this journey, you want to make it as manageable and doable as possible. I.e., if you can, it's that whole like journey of 1,000 miles with a single step, but realistically, if you want to travel 1,000 miles, you're going to be 700 miles in, still taking steps, each step at a time. And that is going to be years later. And I think that's a really, really valuable piece of advice to anyone doing anything, is what can you sustain? Because consistency, I'm sure you've seen that graph,
Yeah.
where consistency isn't, a perfection every day. It's just, have you shown up and done the bare minimum? Sometimes you're going to be able to do more, but have you been able to show up?
Yeah.
Can you not drop the ball? I think that's such an interesting frame, and I really appreciate that, because that's counter to a lot of advice,
Yeah.
and perhaps it's the mass commercialization of everything, in that,
Oh,
if
absolutely.
you're trying to commercialize results, you want to say, oh, you can do this in X big thing in X in Y shorter time frame, and eventually the two come together where you can become an overnight millionaire. And realistically, it never looks like that. Maybe a good business example is as Alex Hormozy's newest book launch, where in 72 hours he generated over $105 million. You could argue that he made $100 million overnight, or near enough.
Yeah.
But realistically, that was
So far from the truth.
so far from the truth. A decade of planning and consistency. And honestly, I didn't realize until I was on the book launch, 2.5 years of like sowing the breadcrumbs
Exactly.
and just outworking everyone.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
I think you're definitely a champion of doing the work quietly, and the results will kind of speak for themselves. And I suppose if you were to give advice, because I'd imagine there's a couple of people listening to this, and maybe one of them is interested about hybrid sport or training, how would you, as the gold standard, Omnia and yourself, for hybrid coaching, like what is the best way, or like a good way to enter into hybrid training?
The single most important thing is minimum effective dose. What is the minimum I can get away with in my two chosen endeavors? And I'm going to choose running and strength here because it's simple. What is the minimum I can get away with and still make progress in both? And then just be patient and expand your time horizons. Now, it has become the norm, particularly in social media, for everybody to think that this is all about training twice a day. You run every morning, and there's plenty of influencers that do this. They run every morning, they lift every evening, the bodybuilders, they show how jacked they are, they put up training montages every day. And for the vast majority of people, that's just not realistic. And for what I've achieved myself, it averages out as probably like no more than 6 sessions a week, in that I rarely do double days. If I do, it's probably 1 or 2 a week, absolute maximum. And realistically, it's just stacking those bricks over a long enough time period. You probably are not going to achieve elite. Well, we can get rid of the probably. You're not going to be an elite runner of 3 runs a week. It's just not going to happen. But people drastically underestimate just how far you can get with that. If you'd have told me 10 years ago that off an average of 2 to 3 runs a week, I'd be knocking on the doors of a 36-minute 10K, I'd have laughed you out of the room. But over a long enough period, you think about how many runs over a decade that is if I run 3 times a week. That is such an obscene amount of practice and accumulated reps that over that time period, it's a no-brainer. It makes sense. But people forget this, and they're impatient, and they often, through no fault of their own, they see what all these other influencers are doing, and they think that to achieve these kind of hybrid results, you have to be training twice a day, every day, and it's just not true. I would say for the vastest majority of my training career, it is averaged out as 3 to 4 strength sessions a week. Actually, we can open up that average to 2 to 4 strength sessions a week, because in periods where I've really been pushing endurance, it's only ever been sort of 2 strength sessions a week, 2 to 4 strength sessions a week, and then 2 to 4 endurance sessions a week. That's it. That is what has built me up to these challenges, because I've done it for long enough. And that is what people forget. This is so much more approachable than so many people online make it out to be. It is not overly complex. It is not massively unapproachable. If you want to push running and lifting at the same time, if you just do 2 to 3 sessions of each a week, you will get better. And particularly if you follow some of the principles that we use to prevent or certainly minimize the effect that those modalities have on each other. There's a lot that people get wrong there, and probably that's a whole other deep dive into sort of like the most common mistakes here. But it doesn't take much to minimize or to certainly offset the worst impacts of each other on these two things. So yeah, if there's one single takeaway for people to push their running and their strength, or as I said, any two components of fitness that don't directly support each other, what is the minimum effective amount of work you can get away with and still make progress in each, and only build from there as and when necessary? Just start with that and build from there.
Phenomenal advice. And what's curious is actually that directly reflects your approach to, any endeavor. It seems like is, what is it? What is the amount that I can do to stay in the game? And, longitudinally, you can guarantee as time goes on, you will get better at that thing. If you do something 3 times a week, every week for 10 years, like you said, you're going to be able to take that really quite far. And I think I think it's disrupting this short-term mentality amongst people.
Yeah.
I think that was really, really, really phenomenal advice. When I think about high performance or high performers, you're someone that I immediately think of. You're someone who I've always looked up to in an athletic, in a professional context. And I'm just curious you've mentioned a couple of times, the people that you look up to. So who are some people that you look up to? Because I'm curious.
Okay, I love this question because I have a really, really sort of powerful story that I've never forgotten in terms of, and it sums everything up so nicely in that we had quite a junior soldier leave our squadron when I was at 216, and he gave a really good leaving speech about role models and everything like that. And his dad had been in the army as well. And he always said that this soldier's dad had always said that you need at least 3 role models in life. One is somebody junior to you or younger than you, or sort of further behind in your career than you, but who you look at and is doing better than you were at that stage. And you look at them and you think, wow, they're doing amazing. They're going to be something. They're certainly better than I was when I was them. You need somebody who's a peer who you look at and they've either sort of overtaken you, they're doing better, or they're your co-worker that you go to for advice. The person who perhaps has been in your job longer than you, they know their job inside and out. And then you need somebody truly leagues ahead who is your long-term guiding star, who you look at and think, in 10 years time, 20 years down the line, I want to be there. And that's sort of your long-term trajectory. How do I get there? And I think that combination is really, really powerful, because to be honest, with how many times I've chopped and changed careers, I don't really have this I don't really aspire to be like any of these business mentors or anything like that. Some of these truly big names of fitness, like they're not role models to me. The most powerful role models to me have been the other two types, the people who I look at, particularly who are junior to me, and make me up my own standard, because I'm like, bloody hell, they're better than I was when I was troop. So for example, really good friend of mine who was troop commander after me, I look at him and think, he did that job better than I did. Why? because of all these elements that I could pinpoint, and that inspired me to be better in my next jobs, for example. So I think I have learned more from seeing people do the jobs I did better than me, later on down the line, than I have in terms of looking too far ahead and saying, well, in 20 years' time, I want to be Hormozy, for example. Like that to me doesn't motivate, it doesn't guide me, it doesn't offer me anything. Whereas I find those other two types of role models very acutely powerful. And I'm actually coaching a few people now who, when I log onto their Training Peaks, which is the app we use, it is green the entire way up as far as you can scroll. They don't miss a session. They cross every T, dot every I, and that inspires me. Like, you know what? Well, who am I to go miss my session now? I'm telling these people to do this thing, and it's so powerful to me. I find a lot more benefit from looking at those people, as I said, that those other two types of role model personally. So probably not necessarily what you're expecting. There's no sort of like big names I could point to and say, yeah, I really respect this person. I really, really look up to that person, because that's just not really what I'm looking for. It's the little things. Like I said, the athletes that show up and the Training Peaks is green no matter what. The people who inspire me because they did something that I've got context behind and knowledge behind. They did it better than me. How can I learn from them? That kind of thing. So that's what I really, really look up to. And I loved the sort of the power, that the fact that I first heard that story from somebody far junior to me. It really summed everything up so nicely, that somebody gave and it was a really good speech. It was just such a powerful little moment that I've never forgotten, that this idea of those three role models, and I absolutely loved it. So that to me is a very long way of saying what I look up to, I guess.
If anything, I think that's better than any other answer I could have ever expected, because not only have you not given some, obscure reference, which would have been, is what I was interested in, but actually you've given a universal blueprint there for anyone to draw role models from. And I think that's, thank you to that junior soldier's dad, I guess.
Yeah.
But no, I really appreciate you sharing that, because that's honestly, and I don't really say this lightly, because how much I research and consume in terms of leadership and philosophy, etc. But that's probably one of, if not the most widely applicable frameworks for who you should, have as a role model, or who you should take inspiration from. I think that's one of my favorite moments of this whole conversation, actually.
I don't know if that's well known. Perhaps that's come from someone well known, but that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. I've never come across it since.
Yeah.
So perhaps not. But yeah, I thought that was such a powerful moment, and it stayed with me ever since.
Yeah, well, clearly. I mean, it literally is. It makes perfect sense, because you're exactly right. I mean, they say that the best mentor isn't 10 steps ahead; they're 2, 3 steps ahead.
Actually, yeah.
And I think having that, it just engages so many muscles in terms of self-development, because obviously you have the aspirational, you have the peer who actually inspires some competition, but also, mutual respect, keeps you humble in your current state. And you have someone who's behind you, which activates that whole, they say that entrepreneurship is, a thinly veiled self-development tool. And I think that extends into leadership. Leadership makes you into the obligation, or the responsibility, that comes with leadership, forces you to become a better person. You have to lead by example if you want to succeed. And I think that activates that muscle. Fantastic. I really, really appreciate that. And I suppose we'll bring it into land here. And I've borrowed the tradition from the Diary of a CEO of having a question from one of my previous guests, who's also a high performer, and leaving that for you. And you'll be able to leave your own question for someone off in the future. They're not recording in the same chronological order, if that makes sense. So your question is, why are you doing what you're doing, and what keeps you going?
That I love, because coaching is a very personal thing, and very, very often And I think most coaches agree with this. It's never the truly massive success stories. It's the little moments. So for example, I've coached people who have then gone on to pass special forces selection. That's really cool. It looks shiny on a bit of paper where I can say I've coached these people to do this. What really, really gets me excited is I've coached somebody who has never trained before and now has the fitness to go on his first ever hike. That is truly, that expands somebody's world. That now gives that person the chance to go and enjoy the things that I truly love. Or it's the people who, particularly in the hybrid space, were just so fed up of feeling like they couldn't do the things they enjoyed because they wanted to be good at, say, a certain sport. So I've coached somebody for years and she was more on the strength side. And now she's able to go off and enjoy bagging Munros, for example, in the Scottish Highlands, or going off and doing endurance events, for example. Those little moments are just so, so powerful. And that for me is the whole reason that keeps me coaching, because I know what I enjoy. And I see so many people who can't enjoy that because they're not fit enough, they're not healthy enough, they don't have this ability to go off and enjoy the outdoors, which you know is probably the single biggest aspect of my life that I enjoy the most, just being outside, no matter the environment. And there are so many people who can't do that because they don't have the fitness, and helping people to go off and experience some of the things that I have, and just to be able to, not necessarily things that I have, things that I know they'll enjoy, for example, it's so, so powerful. So I know for a fact I will be involved in the fitness industry in some regard for hopefully as long as I can possibly manage, even if it's not necessarily the same form throughout that entire journey, which I'm sure it won't be. I would like to stay connected to this industry as much as I can, because there are so few other places where you can have such a monumental difference. And you know this well as a coach. There are so few other avenues in life where you can have such a profound impact on somebody else. So super, super powerful way of looking at things.
I honestly couldn't agree more. And I think that answer speaks to your character. I think it takes a type of person to really, quite frankly, give that much of a fuck about someone else. But I couldn't agree more. That's exactly the reason why I'm coaching in the context that I am now. Why I genuinely believe that ethical, genuine, like sustainability focused, life changing focused coaching is probably the most, I'd say, the most rewarding thing you can do, because, like you said, you're seeing people's lives exponentially improve before your eyes. And I actually understand what you mean. It's not necessarily the height of the change or the height of the dopaminergic, scale. It's the degree of change. It's being able to go from their lowest to achieving something that they never thought was possible. And I think for me, it's a lot of my coaching revolves around being able to help remedy, or at least help navigate these, crushingly difficult times or difficult situations, which I know myself I had to blood, sweat, and everything else toil through, and it really took a lot from me, and helping someone else be able to navigate that in such a graceful way. I couldn't agree more. And I know with Omnia you're doing your like mountaineering weekends, and like the absolute lad, like Scotland, what did we call it earlier? Scotlandeering or Scottishish, whatever.
Yeah. Very, very Scottishness.
That was it. So tell us a little bit about what's coming up, where people can go to see you, to see Omnia.
So you've got my own page, Kieran Richardson _coaching, and very active on the Omnia performance page as well. There's a huge amount going on there. At the moment, we're getting ready for the wintering, which is essentially a group program where if you don't know what you're doing this winter, you've got no motivation to get out of bed. And I felt it this morning, my bedroom was freezing, trying to get out of bed. We all know that struggle. And if you want something to keep you accountable and build towards a goal, let's say you've got no events booked in the calendar, then that's exactly what the wintering's for. So that's our next big thing. And we'll be kicking that off in January. And there's an email list which you can access through Omnium Performance, and you'll be able to be the first to hear about it. But that is absolutely ideal for people that don't have the accountability or the goals set up, as so many of us don't through winter, because obviously so many big events that we all like to do, they're all summer based, or like the more friendly parts of the year, particularly in the UK or other places. So that's the next big thing. And then of course Fergus has Project Tenacity, so a lot of work going on to for that behind the scenes for Omnia. And then yeah, to be honest, for me, it's, as I said, a very developmental year. So dissertation, uni assignments, and that kind of stuff. So
Perfect. Well, listen, Kieran, like I could literally talk to you for hours and hours and hours. I'm trying to be respectful of your time because I know you're super busy at the moment. But thank you so much. I think that you've given so much value in terms of, obviously not just your knowledge, but I think the general way in which you carry yourself through life, through professionally, physically, there's so much that can be learned from that. And I think that the unique genius of your life, you've been able to collect so much experience and information through your humility. So I just want to thank you, obviously, for coming on the show, but also generally for being an incredible peer and friend and mentor, I guess, as well. But I'm excited to hear what your question is going to be for a future guest. But yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate the life out. Yeah.
Yeah, you too, brother, and thank you for having me.